Learning Objective 6, we look at the Fed funds market and bank reserves. So this is really a key market that the Federal Reserve interacts in and is very important for their policy-making decisions. It's also very important for the functioning of our banking system. So let's get a little understanding of this. So we just kind of saw in my last little example that when you use your checking account, there's a transfer between banks. And so when you scale this up to larger amounts across the entire economy, there's money coming in and out of banks all the time. In the billions and trillions of dollars are moving around between banks every single day. And so that generates for banks what I call liquidity needs. So you may have heard this term before, liquidity. And what that refers to basically is something that I can use for payment immediately. So an asset is liquid if I can use it as a payment immediately. And so obviously cash or transactions deposits are the most liquid type of asset, i.e. money, right? So our definition of M2, money, is typically what we mean by having liquidity. I have cash or other transactions deposits in order to make payments. So banks have lots of need for what we call liquidity. So they have all the usual transactions that they have to account for. So when you are buying things, the bank has to transfer money across your account to the merchant's account. As companies pay things like taxes and payroll and all of these other events that happen, right? You get direct deposit. That's your company transferring money from their bank to another bank. And so banks have to have funds to cover all of these transactions. They also want to have liquidity in order to make new loans. So when you go to the bank and you get a car loan, or let's say you go to the dealer and you buy a new car for $20,000, there's effectively a transfer from the bank that finances that to the car dealership for $20,000. And so as banks generate these new loans, they need to have sufficient liquidity, transactions, reserves, in order to finance and make these new loans work. So there's lots of need in the banking system to have liquidity. And that is where the federal funds market comes in, is going to be when banks may not have sufficient liquidity to finance all of these different transactions and new loans. So let's just take a simple example that kind of illustrates this, right? So here's General Electric, which is a relatively big company, and they have 300,000 employees. Okay, so then, like most companies, once a month or once a week, twice a week or twice a month, they have payday. So let's say that these employees here make $7,000 each about per month. Okay, so that's roughly about what the average salary is at a company like GE. Equates to $7,000 per month. So on payday, so let's say that we're coming up to May 1st, GE is going to have to pay $2.1 billion to its employees. And so what's going to happen? Well, GE is going to take their bank account, their transaction account, their checking account, and they're going to do an interbank transfer, direct deposit, to your bank or to the employees' banks, right? And so that's a lot of liquidity that GE needs on a particular day. And so, they may have sufficient. If all the employees bank at the same bank as GE, then there's no problem. But often they don't. They bank at different banks. And so all of a sudden, GE's bank is going to lose a whole bunch of reserves to make these transactions. And other banks are going to get a whole bunch of reserves. And so some banks are going to have a lot of extra reserves, and GE is going to be relatively short. in order to still cover all the other transactions that they have to engage in on May 1st, all the day-to-day stuff. And so it turns out that, sometimes banks may fall a little bit short. So GE's bank may be short on reserves. Right? So remember that the fractional reserve banking part means they don't keep all of their deposits on hand as reserves, and sometimes the transactions demands exceed the reserves that they'll have for the day. So what do? Well, we just said that when this transaction takes place, some banks are going to be flush with reserves, and GE's bank is going to be short. So GE would like to simply borrow some reserves temporarily from those banks that have extra. And that's what they do. Banks will borrow from other banks in what is called the federal funds market. So this is a market for overnight loans of reserves between banks. And yes, those are overnight loans, meaning the bank will pay them back the next day. So this stuff happens all the time. It happens very frequently. And so banks have gotten very efficient at making these loans and paying them off and issuing new loans to cover the old ones and all of that stuff. It happens all the time, and the market runs very well. So this is simply a market that allows banks to satisfy its transactions demand under our fractional reserve banking system. So if GE needs to borrow $2.1 billion, which isn't unreasonable for a bank to borrow in this market overnight, I'm going to borrow this from another bank. And so what would cause a bank to part with its reserves? I have to pay them something, right? And that's going to be interest on the loan. The federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks pay on loans, overnight loans for reserves. So this is the interest rate banks pay on overnight, getting sloppy there, on overnight loans of reserves, which are needed in order to satisfy transactions demands. So as we'll see, this is going to be the interest rate, key interest rate that the Federal Reserve is able to control, which we will develop here coming up shortly.